Yes, hello, and thank you for joining us today at our Expert Talk series. My name is Andreas Stauber. I'm the head of the Advantage Austria office in Washington, D.C. Today we're going to talk about US trade and the changes that took place during the last couple of years. It's going to be a short intro from my side on what has happened so far, what are the new topics that we are facing, and then I'm going to hand over to Nicole Bivens-Collinson from Sandler Travis Rosenberg to give you some better insight on what companies could do to mitigate the effects of the tariffs and what her take is on the current situation with COVID-19 and the state of trade policy in the US at the moment. With this, I would like to start my short intro and mention two sections that are important, Section 232 and Section 301. Please keep in mind those are two different laws that are concerned. But basically what it means that the US administration has taken action based on especially Section 232, which is taken due to reasons of national security, as well as Section 301, which is basically aimed at stopping a practice that is considered unfair, or if there are things in the trade agreement that have not been kept. So those are two different things. And I would think the most important issues in the processes based on Section 232 are first steel and aluminum, and also autos and auto parts, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So Section 232, the first investigation of the current administration was started in April 2017. And that means that the Secretary of Commerce had to compile a report on whether or not for national security reasons action has to be taken concerning steel and aluminum. It took quite a while, and in March 2018, with a proclamation of the president, additional tariffs have been introduced on basic steel products of about 25% and on aluminum products of 10%. Initially, Canada, Mexico, and the European Union were exempt. In the case of the European Union, that exemption stopped June 1st, 2018. So ever since, European companies that send over products, steel and aluminum, that are covered in those tariffs have to pay those additional tariffs. One thing to mention is there are product exceptions. Those exceptions are very narrow, so you would have to file for this exception, and it's available for individuals or organizations using or supplying steel or aluminum articles in the US. And the argument, of course, is that if the product that you're exporting to the US or that your partners are importing and need is not available in the necessary quantity or in the necessary quality, you're able to get an exception. And of course, if this product is necessary due to national security reason, that's another reason that you can quote. The second topic is autos and auto parts. This is I would say, ongoing topic. It started in May 2018. It was expected to see tariffs of up to 20%. And a meeting or a hearing took place in July 2018, where the public could express their take on it. In the same month, there also was a meeting between the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, who agreed with the US administration to build an expert group to find ways to reduce tariffs. And the understanding is that no tariffs will be issued during those talks. So the agreement was we work together towards zero tariffs, zero non-tariff barriers, and zero subsidies on non-auto industrial goods. We will also work to reduce barriers and increase trade in services, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, medical products, as well as soybeans. We have heard that in February 2019, the report on the issue has been delivered to the White House, which also gave recommendations that were not discussed in detail. So the president had time until November 2019 to take a decision, but this deadline passed without any action on the side of the White House. So for now, this topic is not in focus anymore, but it's still being mentioned once in a while by the administration as a way to, or an option to go forward. Now, I also would like to mention the process on Section 301, especially on China and on the WTO case, Airbus and also Boeing. So with China, the argument was that China is not offering the same market access, has issues with intellectual property rights and several more arguments. So 301 is not to do something based on national security, but based on a perceived unfairness, if you want. So in June 2018, two lists of products from China have been issued that were slapped with 25% additional tariffs. There was a volume of about $50 billion US in trade goods. Later on the same year, in September 2018, an additional list, this time about $200 billion has been issued with another 25% of tariffs. And then there was a little bit going back and forth concerning list 4. This list covers goods worth about $300 billion. And basically a deal has been reached at the end of 2019, where the list has been divided in two sublists. List 4A, which is actually the smaller list, had 7.5% tariffs, and list 4B is currently exempt of tariffs. And the deal was that China purchases US goods and services worth $200 billion in the next 2 years, and also committed to structural reforms concerning intellectual property, technology transfer, agriculture, and also concerning the currency. Similar to the previous process on steel and aluminum, there are exceptions possible. Those deadlines passed for now, but there are still deadlines referring to extensions of exceptions, because a lot of companies filed for exceptions. And now the question is, with the two lists, if those exceptions can be extended further. And then the last topic I want to mention, just as an intro, is the case Airbus and Boeing. So this is an ongoing trade topic for about 14 years now. But the Section 301 investigation started in April, where at the USTR, the US Trade Representative Lighthizer, issued a product list, and in October 2019, the WTO authorized measures of the value of $7.5 billion, which gave the US the authority to give those options at the moment. And then the US also mentioned they have the authority to increase tariffs at any time or change the products affected. So this is an ongoing trade issue, and currently we are in one of those phases where the US administration has published a new list of products where they like to get information from the general public on if they should change the current list or if they should add additional products that they suggested. The comments are due July 26, so about 3 more weeks. But at the same time, of course, a decision by the WTO concerning the case on Boeing, so basically the opposite side, is expected somewhere July to September, because the European Union also issued a list of products that they will increase tariffs on for US products, because Boeing also has been found in violation of WTO rules, or better, the US administration has found to be in violation of those subsidy rules. So we will see how this evolves in the near future. And then I just wanted to mention current investigations, which are concerning mobile cranes, electrical steel, and vanadium. Those are all currently ongoing, and I give you the deadlines here until when you can give statements as well. And also to mention the digital tax issue, where previously France was basically being investigated for their tax of digital products. But this has been extended to several other countries, including also Austria and also the European Union as such. So from our side, I think it's important to see as a company if you can or could be affected by those trade policies. You can be affected directly if you're producing something in Austria and sending it over to the US. But you could also be affected if Austria is not involved, but maybe another country is, and you are a subcontractor of another company that delivers the product from another country. And of course, I didn't mention before, but regarding steel and aluminum, the European Union also issued so-called rebalancing measures. So several US products are also being charged tariffs for when they go to the European Union. So that means if you're an Austrian importer, some products might also be affected here. So what we could recommend is, first of all, you should be aware of the possibility, and also be aware whenever you sign a contract or you negotiate a contract to keep this in mind, and to see what would happen if all of a sudden your product is involved in this trade dispute. And then, of course, if you do a statement, I mentioned the ongoing processes. Of course, you have to include your US partner. because of course it's in their interest mainly. I think the US Chamber made it very clear by saying tariffs are taxes for US consumers and companies. So of course it's also the interest of the US companies, with of course few exceptions, not to have tariffs. So you have to work with them together and find a good way to give a statement, for example. But of course, there are several other opportunities and options that you have, which will be handled by our keynote speaker today, Nicole Bivens-Collinson. So I have the great pleasure to invite her to give her keynote. She will speak on several topics, including also what changes might lie ahead now with COVID-19, how she sees the developments. And yeah, without much further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to Nicole. Thank you very much for joining us. And she's also available for questions after her keynote. Thanks a lot.
Sure, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, and I really appreciate being able to come and speak with you today. So I'm going to, this is, in my opinion, what is happening right now is the world has been turned upside down. What's happening across the globe, from big sandstorms blowing across the ocean coming to the United States, to giant hornets coming into the United States, to COVID surging, all of these things. It's a crazy world right now, and I think we're all trying to deal with it. So just for clarity, I do work at Sandler, Travis & Rosenberg. It is an international trade and customs law firm, but I am not an attorney. I am a professional. I've been doing this for almost 40 years now. And my previous experience was working at the Department of Commerce, and I was a negotiator for the United States in the Office of the United States Trade Representative. So if you have a specific question and you would like more binding legal advice, please reach out to us and we'd be happy to provide that. Don't consider this legal advice. So as Andres mentioned, I'm going to touch on a few things. A little bit is going to cover some of what he's already talked about, but I want to put it in the context of where I see trade policy going forward. So first, we're going to look at the overall global impact that COVID has had on trade. First, I just want everyone to recognize, and you may be very aware of this, how important China is to our global manufacturing. In this chart, you can see where there's coloration of those countries that rely on China for intermediate manufactured parts. In other words, they cannot continue producing unless they have these inputs from China. Because the COVID virus first hit in China, there was an initial reaction across many countries in our manufacturing and our supply chain that were not related to health. That came later. And with that came some declines in individual production, as well as declines in what has happened from our economies. These are major developed countries, and you can see here what are the expected declines in their overall economic performance if there is a single incidence of the insurging of the COVID virus, or if there is a second scenario where we have another round of the COVID virus, which is what we are experiencing right now in the United States. So we can anticipate that our economy is going to decline even further as a result of the changes. So what has this meant overall from trade? It's not just China, but I think it's important to see some of the major players. For example, South Korea, their exports have declined by more than 20% in May. And that's the second month in a row. It's not just a one-off. This is happening multiple months. For Japan, their shipments have declined more than 20% as well, 1/5. And they are seeing that same weakness in May that they saw in April. The biggest declines have been in the autos and the automobile parts. And a lot of that is attributed to the fact that for the months of April and May and June, most of the US and the EU were shut down, and manufacturing was not happening at the scale that it traditionally happens. So the decline in the exports from those countries not only were because of the COVID virus going through the country, but also because even exporting it, the countries weren't ready. The economists are predicting that at least for another 1 to 2 months, we're going to see these continuing declines. And I wanted to show you these graphs because I think it really gives you visually the impact that this virus has had on our trade, not only in the United States, but on a global basis. And this isn't expected to change anytime soon. If you look here, the supply chain, this is something that I think has been underestimated. The impact that the virus has had on how goods actually move. Because one of the things that we saw is that many shipping lines just stopped their shipments, where you may have been able to export or to book a ship to export your goods 7 days a week. Now suddenly, because of the decline in trade and back and forth or across oceanic traffic, that has stopped. And now they may only ship 3 days a week. But then it's more competitive to try to get your goods on that ship than one of the 3 days a week that it's leaving. And so prices have gone up. So it's created this horrible backlog as well. You can see that overall in the month of April, over 212 ship departures were canceled. For the Asia to the EU route, that has declined by 34%. It gives you an idea of what's going on. So overall, most of the ports around the globe have dropped by 1/4 the number of vessels and containers that they are offloading and the shipments they are making. One of the things I think is interesting as well is we're seeing containers piling up, either empty or full. You have a situation where if you have the containers in one port, but they need to be in another country, but there's nothing to put them in, so they're not moving. So you have empty containers, and there are about 5 of the major shipping lines, cargo shipping lines, have reported storing empty cargo containers in different ports strategically, so that when trade starts picking up, it'll be a short trip to get them. Some of them are in the Middle East, some of them are in South Africa, some of them are on the African continent, so they can quickly come in, get the containers they need, and then move them to the right place. But that's going to cause a problem. So that's an empty container problem. The other problem we're seeing now in the United States especially is cargo that is sitting full on the dock. And the reason it is sitting full is because just as we were entering into our COVID shutdown of our economy, China and Asia was coming out, and they were beginning to ship the goods. The cargoes then arrived at our ports, but there were many times whenever they were unable to be offloaded, either because of the virus or because once the cargo arrived at the dock, the companies are suffering so economically, they don't have the cash available to pay for the goods to take receipt of the shipment. The other problem has been inland transportation. So if the goods come into our borders on either side of the ocean, we still have to get those goods into the country. And we've had problems with respect to our truckers because the truckers have not been, they've been available, but they've also been subject to the COVID. So we have infrastructure problems within the United States trying to get the goods to move off the cargo. So it's one of the things that we're seeing, and we are talking to our clients about, is being aware of any changes in the shipping schedules, being aware that the ship may actually take a longer route than it normally takes. And part of that is because they know that if they get there too soon, they may not be able to offload in a timely fashion. So please make sure that you're connecting with your shipping lines to see what the schedules are, when they are anticipating clearing, if they see any backups at any of the ports in the United States, and what that time frame may be, because we have had some companies who run into this problem, and it's been an issue for getting the goods offloaded and into the United States. But one of the biggest problems we've seen here, at least in the United States, has been in our retail. And you can see here it's been a tremendous, tremendous drop. I don't have any more updated information because companies were starting to resume some operation in the US over a little bit in May and in June. We are expecting that there may be an upturn, but it may drop back down as more of our states open, and we're finding these surges in the cases of the virus. So as we've seen this change, the other thing that we are recognizing with many of our companies is they're looking at this almost as a permanent, not as a temporary issue, but they see that some of the changes that have been demanded because of the virus may be practices that they're going to continue into the future. In other words, the online sales have increased tremendously. As a result of the online sales increasing, you've had issues with respect to inventory, maintaining inventory and keeping inventory. The question becomes, does the exporter maintain that? And do I really work on a just-in-time delivery? You know, so that if I buy this blouse, when I pay for it at the register and they scan my barcode, the barcode will trigger immediately an indicator to the manufacturer that, oh, the black and white blouse has been sold, we need more in stock. That model had been in place for a lot of US retailers. But what has happened because of the COVID in companies coming offline at different times for manufacturing, it has failed miserably. So the issue now is if I'm going to be placing orders, who's going to hold the inventory? Is it going to be me or is it going to be you? And I think we're going to see a bit of a change where if you had been manufacturing and you were accustomed to this just in time, that may change. And you may have more of a fluctuation in your manufacturing and delivery times where they will make an order, stock up, hold that inventory until it starts to be significantly depleted, then place a new order, and then you have to manufacture. So you may actually see manufacturing kind of going up and down. We're not really sure, but I know that I've talked to several CEOs of major companies, and they're looking at changing it. They're also looking at how they're changing the structure of sourcing. Less of a global approach and more of a targeted hub and spoke, focusing on a verticality in one country so that if they get hit once, if another pandemic comes, they're not going to hit if they supply a product that uses semiconductor chips produced in South Korea, that then go into China, that are then incorporated into a plastic cap, that then go into the United States and are put into a finished container. They don't want to have the impact 3 different times. Whenever the pandemic hits Korea, when the pandemic hits China, or when the pandemic hits the United States, or any other step along the way. So we're looking at some changes that I think are going to come about as a result of the COVID and how we are moving forward. So one of the issues, of course, as I mentioned, is the rise and fall of coronavirus cases in the United States. The US is the largest consumer. When our market is doing well, everybody can sell. But if our retail operations are closed, then we can't sell the goods. So what we're looking at right now is just as we were starting to come back into the operations, we're likely going to fall away again. Largest number of cases were detected and reported yesterday. It's not a good thing. There is something to saying you don't want to be the world's number one. And this is one of those issues where we don't want to be number one. We don't want to be in this position. So hopefully it's going to go away. So let's take a look at how do I think that this, what is the US going to do as its trade policy looking in a post-COVID environment? So, just as Andreas mentioned, there are several different tools that are in the toolbox for the president where he can take certain actions against imported goods. That is the Section 232, the Section 301. There are these things called circumvention investigations, or IAPAs, which is authorized under different laws, allowing you to look at whether or not products are actually made in a country of origin, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. We are expecting an increased use of our anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations. I mean, Austria has been subject to several investigations over the years, and we expect to see that more. And then there is the AIPA, which is another provision which allows the president more to go after financial than to go after actual physical goods. But some of your companies might have some issues and have investments in banks and things that are dealing with the United States that could be attacked by that. I also think that we're going to see a continuation of free trade negotiations and the United States using its position as the largest consumer market to try to extract concessions. We have Kenya, the UK, Brazil, India, EU, Japan, and China. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these as we go forward. So first, let's take a look. As Andres mentioned, we do have the Section 232. There's one that is still pending on autos. And I think it's important to note, one thing I wanted to just highlight is Andres indicated that the deadline for taking action passed in November of 2019. There is a question, a legal question, if the president can now take action under the previous investigation. We already found an instance where the court ruled against the administration whenever they increased the steel tariffs on Turkey. They had a certain amount of time when they put tariffs in place, which is allowed under our statute, but then a certain amount of time passed and the president decided to double the tariffs on Turkey. Well, there was a court challenge and the court ruled you can't do that. So we're not sure that there may be action on autos. What could happen is if the White House were to put tariffs on there, there's a very good position to challenge those in the court, and likely the government will lose in court. But in the meantime, there could be tariffs that are in place at least for a certain period of time. The other is on the 232. Just on June 22nd, there was a challenge against the administration on the actions that they've taken for the 232. It advanced to the Supreme Court, but they refused to hear it. So that one, although there was a challenge on what they have done, it was a different challenge. It wasn't with respect to a timeline, as I mentioned with Turkey, but it was with respect to the authority of the president to take action and invoke it. So that challenge has failed. It's not going to move forward. But as Andres mentioned, there is this exclusion process. And an individual company can solicit for an individual product to be free from these quotas or these tariffs. And that only applies to that company for that product. So it's very, very company specific. What this has brought about is a question as to if there is favoritism. So I might ask for it and I get it, but Andres may ask for it. And perhaps he is a steel company or a steel importer that was a competitor of Secretary Ross, who's the Department of Commerce. This is where the decisions are made at the Department of Commerce. And Secretary Ross used to own steel. Maybe he doesn't like Andres. So he says, I'm going to give it to Nicole, but not to Andres. There was an internal investigation at the Department of Commerce into this. And that investigation resulted in a management warning. And in the world of bureaucracies, that's a big action. Whenever the actual inspector general issues a warning saying, we're not happy with how you're managing this system. We don't think it's transparent. We see opportunity for favoritism. And so we want to conduct a review. So they're in the middle of doing this review right now. And the comments on that are due on July the 10th, if you're interested in having any input on saying how bad their system is, because it is bad. Also, as he mentioned, there were 3 new Section 232 investigations that were initiated just in May and in June. Shows you how the administration is starting to use these tools going forward. There were some new Section 301 investigations, again, as Andreas mentioned. Those comments are due, and there's a bit of an issue because digital sales taxes are a concern, but there's probably about 50 different countries right now who have proposed digital sales taxes. The US is one of the countries who will be impacted the most because of our large service providers in these countries, in all of these countries. The effort had been to try to get a global agreement using the OECD, but the US was basically blocking any progress, any forward movement. Eventually, we pulled out of the talks. So at this point, every country should, in my opinion, fend for themselves, because if there's not going to be a global agreement, and if everyone else agrees, but the United States is not a part of it, it doesn't make any sense to have the agreement. So, we're going to probably see some tariffs imposed as a result of the digital sales tax. So I would say if you're exporting, be ready for some additional tariffs on your exports. The other thing is that the US is right now considering investigating the agricultural standards that the EU has in place. So again, the US could take additional tariff action on the EU once this investigation gets started. There's a lot of tariffs going on, and I'm sure you're very aware of the Airbus, which Andres talked about, and there's a carouseling process. In other words, you can rotate goods on, rotate them off. That's happening right now. The other area where we've seen unilateral action is the president has directed the Secretary of Agriculture to look at our lobster industry and determine if they need some support. So at the same time, the United States is getting ready to launch Section 301 on the EU's agricultural support system, we are looking at putting in place some agricultural supports. So, sometimes the irony, I think, is lost on people. With respect to the FTAs going forward, Kenya was supposed to have already started. They've delayed that basically because the African continent free trade agreement was supposed to go into effect on July 1st, but because of COVID, it was delayed. After that comes online, we're expecting that it's going to move forward. The other countries that we're looking at, of course, are the US, UK. We just concluded our second round. All of the negotiations are happening virtually, just like we're doing now. The UK has said they wanted to conclude the agreement by November, or to have the agreement done by November. If that is the case, they would have to conclude negotiations in August. The reason is because our law under which this is being negotiated, which is called the TPA, stipulates that you have to notify of your intention to sign and conclude an agreement. And that in order to sign and conclude an agreement before our November elections, you would have to wrap up negotiations in August, and that's just not going to happen. So the USTR has stated that they don't expect this to happen until 2020, or it's not likely to happen in 2020. With respect to Brazil, EU, and India, we keep hearing that there's going to be a deal. Everyone now anticipates that any deal with Brazil or India is going to be very limited. With respect to the EU, negotiations have not moved forward. All of these issues, the digital sales tax, the pending ruling, as Andres mentioned, of the WTO in favor of the EU over the Boeing case and potential tariffs, our threatened tariffs, another investigation on agriculture subsidies. We don't see that that's going to help us move forward. The other thing I think is interesting, and just to keep your eye on from a viewpoint of where is the U.S. trade policy going for the future, is right now there is a congressionally mandated report from the ITC to Congress that they have to conduct. There's two of them. The first one was done in 2015, and now this one is 2021. And this is just looking at all of our free trade agreements. What have we done? What is working? What's not working? You can see the schedule here. But I think that this report could be instrumental in dictating what the policy on free trade agreements is going to be going forward. So I would highly encourage that folks look at that to see what might be indicative of the future. Now, what about Congress? What is happening in all of this? There initially were some efforts for legislation to reform the 232 because no one is happy with the way the 232 is put in place for steel or aluminum. Many members of Congress were upset. The problem is we had two competing approaches that were introduced, and the two could not be brought together. So at this point, I don't believe that we're going to see any type of reform on 232 in this Congress, meaning by the end of this year. The NDAA, which is the National Defense Appropriations Act, that is, I mean, every agency has to be authorized by Congress so that they can continue to work and pay. But this one, the defense one, always gets through in a timely fashion. What we're seeing are a lot of interesting amendments. Some of them are on GSP. I know you are not eligible, but some of your companies may be using GSP goods produced elsewhere to come into the United States. But the other one that I think is really important to watch is there's an amendment introduced by Senators Casey and McSally to amend the way the country of origin is disclosed online. And right now, everybody knows you have to have a label that says, where the good was made, where the product was made. Now they're going to say, if you have an online presence, not only do you have to say where the product is made, but you have to say where the inputs were made. So where was my fabric made? Where were my buttons made? You also have to say whether or not if you did any assembly of anything, partial assembly in another country. It's in my mind, it's ridiculous. It's really trying to look at your supply chain and trying to determine, are you using inputs from China? Are you using inputs from Russia, some other country? So I think this one we need to watch. There's also the withdrawal from the WTO. That looks like the effort to have that vote has been quashed by the Rules Committee in the House, but it still may be voted on in the Senate. The last time we voted on whether or not to withdraw from the WTO was in 2005. So it's kind of a surprise that we're seeing this. I'd also like to point to there's a lot of legislation being introduced that is focusing on Hong Kong and China, sanctions, retaliation, freezing of assets, banking restrictions, travel restrictions. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. It's going to get worse before it gets better. And then another concerning trend I'm seeing in Congress is, I kind of mentioned how this rule of origin disclosure is trying to get at your supply chain. We're also seeing that legislation is being introduced, which right now is limited to medical devices, pharmaceuticals, and semiconductor production. But I don't know how far these are. And these bills are very invasive, in my opinion, into free enterprise and capitalism and manufacturing efficiencies. Because what they're asking, in some instances, are if you source from a certain provider, a certain country outside of the United States for any inputs in a medical device or in the pharmaceuticals, that you have to get that source approved by the appropriate government agency. Now that, in my opinion, is getting way too into supply chains and how things work. We're seeing this grow. It is a concern. I have some members of Congress that I spoke to, both Republican and Democrat, who are equally worried about this slow crawl and creep to try to take some of that away from companies and manufacturers. So it's something we need to watch. Just to give you some ideas, USTR Lighthizer did have to give testimony before the House and the Senate, the Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. These are some of the issues that he brought up. It's available online if you'd like to watch it. It is definitely entertaining. The text of his testimony, if you are interested and you want something to read, let me know and I can share that with you. It's always interesting to see what he says. But one of the things I also want to talk about is all of this going on, where my anticipation is that for the end of this year and into next year, we're going to see some efforts by the administration to really shut down our borders, to use unilateral actions to go after our trading partners, to impose additional tariffs. One of the things that USTR Lighthizer mentioned that I didn't highlight, but I will now, is that he also talked about going back to the WTO and changing our tariff commitments. Some of you may know that every country, when you become a member of the WTO, you put forward your tariff schedule and you say, these are our bound rates. Many countries have a bound rate of 30%, 35%. At least developing countries may have a 50% tariff. But that's not your applied rate. The actual applied rate when I import something into Austria may be 6%, but your bound rate is 25%. So that gives you this flexibility between 6% and 25% that you can increase your tariff and I can't complain against you at the WTO. The United States, however, doesn't have that flexibility. When we notified, we bound our rates at the applied rate, which means any rate that's in place right now, we're not supposed to increase it above it. But the US wants to resubmit and say, we're going to put a 30% MFN rate, bound rate, which means at any time we could increase our applied rates up to that new bound rate on all countries. So that's something else we need to watch for. So all of this means, how do I try to keep my goods affordable? How do I compete with other producers? There's several different approaches immediately. You can look at trying to get some pricing changes agreed with your provider. You may use a bonded warehouse or a foreign trade zone in the United States. It's not going to remove the tariffs, but it might help you to manage your cash flow. You're still going to have to pay the duties when you extract the goods from the bonded warehouse or from the foreign trade zone, but from a cash flow perspective, it might provide some relief. Another short-term thing that you can do is look at the tariff under which, or the harmonized tariff schedule number under which you are exporting the goods or entering them into the United States. Sometimes we may be able to look at that number, and instead of applying a 25% tariff, maybe it goes in a different number that's only 7.5% tariff. Or it may be that the product that you have coming in is classified as a distilled spirit and there's a tariff on it because of the Airbus issue, and we might be able to classify it as a different type of product that is outside of that tariff, the additional, punitive tariff. The other is in the event that there is exclusion requests, seeking an exclusion request, or looking at some that have been granted to see if you can kind of squeeze yours into that description legally. I mean, everything we do is legal. Don't get me wrong, but if we can, if maybe you have all of the dimensions that are mentioned, and maybe you also have an insulated pocket in a duffel bag, and that insulated pocket is not going to exclude you. You can still use it. So we work with people looking at that. On a medium term, we have this concept in the United States. It used to be in the EU, but it is no longer. The EU voted it out, of first sale, meaning if you are a company who may purchase goods from XYZ to export to the United States, but XYZ actually supplied those to you from ABC company, you can use the value that ABC charged your provider, XYZ. So the first sale, that value can be used. So instead of paying a duty, 25% duty on your distilled spirits from the EU, I might be able to pay it for, and let's say the value of your shipment is $100. Instead of paying it on $100, I may be able to pay it on $89, which was the first sale. That's how much it initially cost. So it reduces the liability. The other is using, if you are into e-commerce, or if you're able to provide your product on e-commerce, we currently have an $800 limit that if your product is less than $800, you can bring it into the United States with no duties and none of the punitive duties. Many companies are setting up their e-commerce fulfillment centers in Mexico and Canada, and then sourcing in direct to the consumer using this provision to avoid the tariffs. The other is shifting your production, and that may be doing the origin conferring operations in a second country. In other words, maybe you're producing a good that becomes subject to tariffs in Austria, but you can do part of the production in Austria and do the main essence of the product in Romania, and now it becomes a product of Romania, and it's no longer under those tariffs. So you can do that. The other is transfer pricing. This is a review. It's technical. We can go through it. Basically, we do it after goods have entered, and we can look at how goods have been done and move some of the different, maybe it's the shipping costs, maybe it's an insurance cost, but moving some of that around so that the pricing is lowered, and that helps to minimize it. On the long term, there are miscellaneous tariff bills, which is a process to remove or suspend duties for 3 years. That takes some time. There is potentially, if you use U.S. inputs, instead of using all foreign inputs, you can reduce by the value of that U.S. input, so at least it reduces it. And maybe your product is, for you, it might be difficult, but you may be sourcing from a country that has, that product does not currently get GSP status, but it might in the future. So there's several different ways you can go about trying to minimize your tariffs. And I just want to point this, some resources that we provide. We have a tariff page that has all of this information on it. We also have a daily newsletter that covers just trade issues, and they're very, very useful. So I would highly recommend them to you. And with that, I will stop and take some questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nicole. I think there was a great overview, a very detailed overview, including what Congress is about to plan and what companies can expect in the near future. It's now time for everyone to ask questions. We have one question that was referring to the current situation with China and about the effect of COVID-19 on the US-China trade. I think just recently China asked for guarantees that US soybeans are 100% COVID-19 or let's say coronavirus free. What is your assumption? Is it going to be like a catalyst for the relations? Is it going to completely change particular aspects?
I think we're seeing an escalation between the US and China, and I think both countries are looking for an excuse not to meet the commitments of the Phase 1 deal, because China can't, there is just no way that China can meet the commitments that they pledged in this deal. But neither China's President Xi or the US President Trump want to admit that that deal is going to fail. So they're trying to find ways, other ways to sort of put the blame on why the deal is going to fail. And they're using the virus as one of those excuses. The thing that we're also seeing is that as China's looking at these non-tariff barriers, which this is a non-tariff barrier, the US may retaliate even stronger. And I think we saw yesterday there was a joint advisory issued by the Department of State, Department of Commerce, Department of Treasury, and Department of Homeland Security. So all four agencies that issued an advisory against two US companies, and basically all companies need to be aware of this, cautioning with respect to trading in certain areas of China, in particular the Xinjiang region, and also in any companies that might be producing in China using any type of labor that has been transferred, transitional labor from Xinjiang into other provinces of China. And it's part of this is there is allegations of detention centers and forced labor in the Xinjiang region, particularly with respect to the Uyghur people. I've seen in the EU now that there's one of your ministers, EC ministers, who has been Instagramming and using social media to talk about the horrible conditions of the Uyghur Muslim people in this region, and that the EU itself is contemplating taking actions against China that might result in tariffs or other things like we are doing because of the way they are treating these people. So I see that it's going to get a lot worse, I think, before it gets better, whether the coronavirus is used as the excuse or the treatment of the Muslim people in one region of China. No one is looking for a way to save the relationship. And also with our presidential election, you have a match between Trump and Biden, each one trying to be more strict and more of an enforcer on China. So I think things could get a little bit crazy in the short term. But it's not just in the US, it could be happening in the EU too.
Thank you very much. Before I ask a technical question that we have received, I maybe add to your comments you were mentioning the ongoing election campaigns. Do you think there will be a big change in case the US administration changes after November 3rd? Or, for example, with steel and aluminum, or maybe even with the WTO in general and with the Airbus Boeing case? Or is it just too early to know what might be a difference at the approach of a new president and new administration?
Well, I will say one of the areas that we've noticed, because I've been in trade all my life, but that trade is the area where you will rarely see a presidential candidate talk. They don't want to put forward their trade position. They want to kind of reserve what they're going to do and how they're going to handle issues. So right now, the Biden campaign has really only stepped forward with respect to what they would do vis-a-vis China. I just got this morning a copy of Joe Biden's statement on China, and that he intends to, he's going to hold China accountable to every aspect of the two laws that we've already passed with respect to Hong Kong human rights and the Uyghur rights bill, human rights bill. And he wants to look at other ways to take action and keep forced labor out of our supply chain. So that's the only area where I've seen him so far speak out with respect to what we might see on the 232s or on the Airbus or Boeing or WTO. I think that we have seen historically, the Democrats have been, although they're the ones who generally have brought up challenges and votes to withdraw from the WTO, we've seen a role reversal. And we have the Democrats right now being more supportive of trade than we do the Republicans. Historically, it's been the other way around. It's been the Republican administrations under Bush 1 and Bush 2 especially, that really focused on international trade. The most free trade agreements we ever had were under George W. Bush. So, now we're seeing a switch where they don't want to do trade. They're trying to shut down. And you have the Democrats who came forward and supported the USMCA more than they have anyone else. You also have the Democrats, it's Speaker Pelosi, who has shut down. I mentioned they were going to try to have a vote to withdraw from the WTO. She shut that down. She did not want that vote to happen because they don't want to withdraw from it. So I think there's going to be some change, but I also don't think we're going to see have a good, clear indication of what that might be, just simply because presidential candidates don't want to talk about trade.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The technical question I mentioned earlier was regarding the Airbus case. I think I know the answer, but the question was, can products that are not related to Airbus be slammed with extra tariffs? So basically, can any product be included in one of those product lists?
And the answer is yes. There was about a decade ago efforts to renegotiate some of those provisions in the WTO to allow the action to be taken place on not just limited to like or similar goods, but to be also levied on any type of product, as long as it doesn't exceed that value that's been granted.
And the other question was also maybe a little bit more technical on the tariffs on steel and aluminum, since it was argued it is introduced due to national security reasons. What is the legal status of the argument? Has this been challenged? Can this be avoided? Because of course anyone can claim national security. Is there a current update on this aspect?
So there have been 3 different cases that were brought against the administration for the 232. One of them was looking at, the most recent one that didn't get past the Supreme Court, was looking at whether or not the president had exceeded his authority that he was granted, looking specifically at national security. There were others that challenged the Department of Commerce, one that challenged the White House. So each one had a little bit of a different angle, but so far none of them have advanced and the courts have ruled in the administration's favor. So does that, what does that mean for the future? It's not clear. That's why we had hoped that we might see Congress take action to fix the 232 so that we aren't in this situation. But I don't think we're going to see those changes. I think that Congress wants to still give the president the authority when our national security is truly threatened to take action. And as you stated, I mean, anyone can therefore claim national security. You could say that we were going to put tariffs on imported foods because it's in our national security to make sure that we are self-sufficient with food. But that's, you would have to challenge that. And is food really one? Which is sort of the issue we have with respect to autos and auto parts. I think that's why the White House has not taken any action, because that is one that might be really hard to withstand a court challenge, because we do produce so many cars and vehicles here in the United States and so many automobile parts that it doesn't make sense that we are threatened by imports. So I think it might just be on a product by product basis to see what they do. Like vanadium, that one I'm not sure that we can produce the amount that we need because we need outside sources. I also think that it might be something that needs to be addressed in the future at the more global institutions, whether it's the UN, the G20, the WTO, but some other ways to look at what is national security. But right now, there's no court challenge.
Maybe I give you one more last question, since we're a little bit over the time now. I think you mentioned earlier about the products that are stuck on the US import docks. Do you have data on it? Like what kind of volume are we talking about? Or do you know where we could find
the data? Yeah. Actually, I don't have that data. I gave a presentation looking at that about 6 or 8 weeks ago, so I don't have updated data. But there's, if you want the additional information, I could find some sources where you could look at the ports and what's clearing and what's not. I've been working a lot with Port Everglades in Florida, and they're the ones who have been sharing a lot of the cargo container information with me. So it varies by port to port. For example, we had several ports that actually shut down. There were 2 ports in Virginia that closed that normally would take in cargo, but because of the COVID, they completely shut down. Their cargo had to be diverted, which then caused backlogs of, again, too much sitting on the dock to be distributed, and not the ability in the infrastructure to move it around. So it kind of fluctuates, and I think it's something you have to monitor.
Well, thank you very much, Nicole. It was great to hear your presentations, and thank you also for answering those questions. And to everyone else, I would also like to thank you for your interest. If I couldn't ask the question that you submitted now in the chat, please just send us a quick email, and we will try to find out everything you need to know. And yes, with this, I would like to close the webinar. Thank you very much, and stay safe.